July 1st, 1944, Hollandia Airfield, New Guinea. The morning sun hit the metal planes like fire. The smell of fuel, oil, and sweat filled the air. Tired pilots stepped down from their P-38 Lightnings, their fuel tanks nearly dry. But one plane still had enough fuel to cross the ocean. Everyone stared. How could this be? A civilian, not even a soldier, had flown the same mission with the same plane, but used almost half the fuel. His engines were supposed to be ruined. Instead, they were running smoother, cooler, better. That day, American pilots realized something shocking. To fly farther, they had to break the very rules they were taught to obey. Stay with us to discover how ruining their engines helped U.S. pilots fly twice as far and change the course of air combat forever. Don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and watch till the end, because this true story will change how you see World War II aviation. July 1st, 1944. Hollandia Airfield baked under the New Guinea sun. The jungle buzzed like a giant machine, full of heat, flies, and noise. American pilots in sweat-darkened uniforms wiped grease from their hands and waited for orders. They were tired. Missions were long, fuel was tight, and engines often came home coughing. That morning, a small C-47 transport touched down on the coral runway. From it stepped a tall man with calm eyes and a name every pilot already knew, Charles Lindbergh. The same man who had once flown alone across the Atlantic now stood among combat pilots half his age. He wasn't in uniform, he was a civilian, carrying only a notebook and a pilot's map. But everyone recognized him immediately. A captain leaned toward another and whispered, "What's he doing here?" Lindbergh had come to the Pacific not as a hero, but as a consultant. The United States needed help making its aircraft go farther. The P-38 Lightning, the twin-engine fighter that roared across the sky, was powerful but thirsty. On long patrols over jungle and ocean, many missions had to turn back early because fuel ran low. Some never returned. Pilots followed strict rules from their manuals. Never push the engine too hard, never run over square. That meant the pressure inside the cylinders, the manifold pressure, should never be higher than the engine speed in hundreds of RPM. For example, if you flew at 2200 RPM, the manifold pressure should stay below 22 inches. It was considered a law of nature. Break it, and you'd ruin your engine. Lindbergh didn't believe that. He had spent years testing aircraft engines, learning how fuel and air worked together. He knew that at lower RPM, an engine's pistons moved slower, producing less heat, even if the pressure was higher. To him, the so-called rule was not a law, just a habit. On his first day, he walked quietly among the parked P-38s, touching metal still warm from flight. He asked simple questions. How far do you fly? How long do you cruise? What's your fuel burn per hour? Pilots told him around 100 gallons per hour total, sometimes more. With tanks holding 4 or 10 gallons, that meant a range of about 570 miles. "That's not enough," Lindbergh said softly. "You need at least 700. They laughed. "We'd need a miracle for that." But Lindbergh only smiled. "Maybe not a miracle," he said, "just a new way of flying." That afternoon, under a canopy of palm leaves, Lindbergh drew a quick chart in the dirt with a stick. "If you drop RPM," he explained, "to 1600 and increase manifold pressure to 30 inches, you'll burn less fuel. Run the mixture lean, not rich. You'll move just as fast, but go much farther." A young lieutenant shook his head. "That'll blow the engines, sir. Manuals forbid it." "I've done it before," Lindbergh said. "Engines won't die if you treat them gently. Try it once. See what your gauges tell you." The squadron commander hesitated. His pilots had flown through monsoon storms, through Japanese flak. But this was scarier. Every man had been taught that running over square was deadly. Yet this outsider, calm as a teacher, spoke as if gravity itself could be bent. For 2 days they debated. The engineers refused at first. "Sir, the Army won't approve it," one said. Lindbergh nodded. Then let's not tell the Army until we know. Finally, permission came for a test flight. 4 P-38s, one of them flown by Lindbergh himself. The men called it Lindy's Gamble. Mechanics checked every bolt twice. Some joked that if the engines failed, at least history would record where the great Lindbergh crashed. The morning of the test was humid and gray. Jungle steam rose like smoke. The engines started with deep, throaty growls. Lindbergh climbed into his P-38, checked his map, and spoke over the radio. Cruise at 1600 RPM, manifold 30, auto-lean. There was a pause. 1600, a voice replied, half laughing. Roger that if we make it home. As they rolled down the runway and lifted into the white sky, every pilot stared at his gauges. Would the needles jump? Would the engines shake apart? But instead of shaking, the P-38s purred, steady, smooth, almost lazy. The noise inside the cockpit dropped, and vibration faded. The planes moved at the same speed, but with gentler power. When they landed hours later, Lindbergh's fuel gauges read higher than anyone had ever seen after such a long patrol. He climbed down, smiling faintly. "You see," he said to the mechanics, "sometimes the book is wrong." That night, pilots gathered around in the mess tent, their plates half empty, their minds full. They argued and calculated on napkins. "Could it really be 30% less fuel?" one asked. Another said, "If it works, we could reach the next island chain." Outside, the jungle sang its endless song. The air smelled of sweat, oil, and kerosene. And somewhere between faith and fear, the idea began to take root that maybe by doing what everyone said would ruin an engine, they could save the war's most precious fuel, time. But the proof would come only in the next mission. The next morning, Hollandia Airfield woke before sunrise. The jungle was still dark, but engines were already coughing to life. Pilots moved slowly, tired from too many missions and too little sleep. The air smelled of hot rubber, gasoline, and damp grass. Every man there knew his job: take off, climb to altitude, patrol for hours, and come home with just enough fuel to land. It was a rhythm that left no room for mistakes. The P-38 Lightning was fast and deadly, but it burned fuel like a hungry beast. Each P-38 carried around 410 gallons of fuel, plus drop tanks when needed. At normal power, about 2,200 RPM and a rich fuel mix, it burned 100 to 110 gallons every hour. That meant a safe flying range of about 570 miles. It was enough for short patrols, but not enough to reach the far-off islands where Japanese air bases waited. To make it worse, most pilots were trained in the same way back home. They had been told again and again, never fly over square. Keep RPM high and the engine rich. Better safe than sorry. Those words were like commandments. Pilots repeated them without question, because breaking them could mean a blown piston or a seized cylinder. And in the sky, that meant death. So when Lindbergh suggested flying slower but farther, it sounded impossible. He spent his second day with flight engineers, showing them simple numbers on paper. "Look here," he said, drawing with a pencil. "At 2,200 RPM, you're burning 52 gallons per engine. Drop to 1,600 RPM, same manifold pressure, 30 inches, and your fuel flow drops to around 35. You've saved nearly one-third." The engineers frowned. "But the manuals—" "Yes," Lindbergh said. "The manuals were written for safety, not for range. You've been flying to protect the engine. I'm trying to protect the mission." The truth was, the Pacific wasn't like Europe. Here, the distances were huge, sometimes 700 or 800 miles to the target. Pilots had to fly for 8 or 9 hours over nothing but blue water. The engine settings that worked for short, fast fights over France simply wasted fuel in the tropics. Many of the pilots were still unsure. Lieutenant Bill Thrasher later remembered, "When Lindy talked about dropping to 1,600 RPM, we all thought he was nuts. But he spoke with such quiet confidence, you wanted to believe him." That evening, Lindbergh met the squadron commander under a bamboo awning. The light bulbs buzzed with insects. Maps of the Pacific lay on a wooden table, edges curling in the heat. Lindbergh traced a line from Hollandia to a small dot on the sea, a Japanese supply base far beyond normal range. "You can reach this with my settings," he said, "and come back." The commander stared. "That's over 1,000 miles round trip." "Yes," Lindbergh said, "but if your men keep their power low, they'll still have 50 gallons to spare." It was a bold claim, yet in war, boldness sometimes mattered more than rules. The next morning, the pilots would test the theory on a long mission over the ocean. Lindbergh would fly one of the Lightnings himself. Every pilot knew the risk. They could lose engines, lose planes, or never return. But deep down, they also knew this. If Lindbergh was right, the P-38 could change from a short-range fighter into a long-range hunter. That could mean reaching targets no one had touched before, and maybe ending the war faster. As night fell over Hollandia, the jungle hummed. Mechanics worked by lantern light, checking engines one last time. The men packed emergency rafts, extra rations, and quiet prayers. Somewhere out on the flight line, Lindbergh looked at the row of P-38s, their silver bodies glowing under the moon. He touched the side of his plane and said softly, "Let's see how far you can really go." At dawn, the experiment would begin, July 3, 1944. Dawn came slowly over the jungle. The air was heavy and still, full of the smell of wet earth and engine oil. 4 silver P-38 Lightnings sat in a line, their propellers quiet for now, their wings already warm from the rising sun. Today was the day. Charles Lindbergh climbed into one of the cockpits. His hands moved calmly over the switches and gauges, as if he'd flown this aircraft all his life. The younger pilots around him were nervous, but curious. Everyone wanted to see if his strange method really worked, or if it would destroy the engines. At 800 hours, the ground crew gave the signal. Propellers began to spin. The roar filled the valley and shook the jungle trees. "Lightning Flight 1 ready for takeoff," Lindbergh's voice came through the radio, steady and clear. The 4 planes lifted into the bright sky. Below them, the green jungle rolled away, replaced by the endless blue of the Pacific Ocean. They climbed to 12,000 feet, leveled off, and set their power, 1,600 RPM, 30 inches of manifold pressure, auto-lean mixture. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The engines should have been shaking, coughing, or showing rising heat. That's what every manual warned. But instead, the P-38s ran smooth and quiet. The cockpit vibration dropped. The sound softened to a deep hum. "Feels strange," said one pilot over the radio, "like the engines are asleep." Lindbergh smiled. "They're resting," he replied. "They'll thank you for it later." The flight plan was simple. Fly out over the coast, make a long patrol north of the Japanese base at Rewrote, then return. It would take more than 5 hours, longer than most combat flights. As the formation cruised over open water, pilots checked their gauges again and again. Fuel pressure, cylinder temperature, oil temperature, all normal. The longer they flew, the more they began to relax. Some even started to believe. "Fuel's dropping slower than usual," said Lieutenant Morgan. "At this point, I'm usually down 40 gallons. Now only 25 gone." Lindbergh's calm voice came back. "Keep steady power. Don't rush the engine. Let the air do the work." An hour later, dark clouds gathered ahead. They flew through a wall of tropical rain, water streaking across the windshields. Lightning flashed far below them, white over the sea. Still, the engines purred on. Near noon, they reached their patrol zone. Spotters below reported enemy activity, so the 4 P-38s began a dive through the clouds. The roar grew louder as Lindbergh pushed the throttle forward. The fighters leveled out at treetop height and fired at a line of supply barges hidden along the coast. Explosions bloomed like orange flowers across the bay. Then, with fuel still good, they turned for home. By the time they touched down at Hollandia, the sun was low and the shadows long. The pilots climbed from their cockpits, sweating but smiling. Mechanics rushed in to check the planes. Lindbergh walked to his crew chief and said, "Check the tanks." The chief opened the caps and dipped the metal measuring stick. He blinked, then looked again. "Sir, you still have nearly 100 gallons left." The others gathered around. "That can't be right," one shouted. But when they checked the other planes, the numbers matched. Fuel burn was down by almost 30%. No engines were damaged, no oil leaks. In fact, the spark plugs looked cleaner than usual. That evening, the pilots gathered at the mess tent again. They spread their charts and scribbled new numbers. "At this rate," one said, "our range jumps from 570 miles to almost 750. Someone laughed. "All because we ruined the engines." Word spread fast. Crews from other squadrons came to ask questions. Lindbergh answered each one carefully, showing his logbook and fuel charts. He never raised his voice, never bragged. He just said, "Try it for yourselves." For the first time in months, the airfield buzzed with something new, hope. Maybe they could finally reach those distant islands. Maybe the Pacific wasn't as endless as it had seemed. But the story wasn't finished. The real test would come not from a few brave pilots, but from the hundreds who would soon follow their lead. The next morning, the base was alive with noise. Pilots were talking, laughing, arguing. Mechanics ran between hangars carrying fuel logs and tools. Everyone had heard about Lindbergh's strange flight, the one where he broke the rules and still came home with more fuel left than anyone believed possible. But not everyone was happy about it. Major Thomas Reedy, the operations officer, frowned as he read the report. "This can't be right," he said. 30% less fuel used. At that power setting, the engines should be destroyed. He had seen too many burned pistons and cracked valves to believe otherwise. "If we let this spread," he warned, "we'll be sending pilots to their deaths." Still, curiosity was stronger than fear. Over the next few days, small groups of P-38 pilots began trying Lindbergh's method. They followed his steps carefully. Lower RPMs, lean mixture, steady throttle, no hard climbs, no racing the engines, and one after another, they returned with the same results. Captain John Bolt, a young pilot from the 475th Fighter Group, wrote in his journal, "We all expected to blow an engine today. Instead, we flew longer and landed cooler. It's like the airplane suddenly learned to breathe slower." Engineers were sent to inspect the aircraft. They checked every bolt, every spark plug, every cylinder. The verdict surprised them all. The engines were fine. "Compression normal," one mechanic reported, "oil clear, plugs clean." It was as if the engines preferred the gentle treatment. Soon the base commander himself ordered an official test flight. 3 P-38s would fly with standard power settings. 3 others would use Lindbergh's method. Each would follow the same route, a 600-mile patrol over the Bismarck Sea. When they returned, the results were impossible to deny. The standard planes landed with almost empty tanks. The Lindbergh planes had enough fuel left for another hour of flight. The data sheets showed a 27% improvement in range, with no drop in speed during cruise. For the first time, the idea reached headquarters. Word spread through radio messages and handwritten reports. New power setting increases range. Engine stable. Recommend trial across all units. The Army Air Forces, famous for its strict rules, didn't like surprises. But in war, results mattered more than pride. By mid-July, Lindbergh was flying from one island base to another, teaching pilots his technique. He stood beside their cockpits before takeoff, explaining each dial and lever. "Keep your RPM low," he said softly. "Let the propeller bite the air, not fight it." Some young flyers stared at him with awe. This was the man who had crossed the Atlantic alone. But he never acted like a hero. He only said, "It's not about bravery, it's about understanding your machine." The impact was fast and powerful. Within weeks, P-38 squadrons in the Pacific were flying missions that used to be impossible. They could now reach targets deep inside enemy territory, 1,300 miles round trip, and still have fuel to fight and return. For the first time, they could strike Japanese shipping near the Philippines and the islands north of New Guinea. The tables were turning. One pilot radioed back after a long-range mission, "Tell Lindbergh his trick works. We got home with 20 gallons to spare." In the mess tent that night, someone pinned a new sign on the wall: "Ruined engines and proud of it." The laughter that followed was real. These men had been flying on fear and fumes for too long. Now they had hope. And more than that, confidence. But while the pilots celebrated, Lindbergh's growing fame worried some commanders. He was still a civilian, not a soldier. And not long ago, his political views had made him a controversial figure back home. Some officers whispered that it was dangerous to let him lead military experiments. They couldn't stop the results, though. The numbers told their own truth. As one colonel finally admitted in a memo, "Mr. Lindbergh has achieved what we thought impossible. Range extended, engines intact, recommend full adoption." The paradox was complete. By running their engines softer, American pilots were flying farther and faster than ever before. Still, the greatest test was yet to come: combat. Would these same gentle engines survive the heat of a real dogfight? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected. August 1944. The air over the Pacific shimmered with heat. On a narrow strip of coral and steel called Noem 4 Island, U.S. pilots stood beside their P-38 fighters, checking guns and fuel lines. The talk around the airfield was the same everywhere: Lindbergh's method. But today, it wasn't a test. It was war. A new mission order came through at dawn: attack a Japanese supply convoy near the coast of Borneo, more than 600 miles away. Normally, that distance would be impossible for a round trip. But with Lindbergh's low-power flying technique, the numbers finally made sense. Captain Dan Roberts, one of the pilots, looked at his fuel chart and muttered, "We'll be pushing it." Then he smiled. "But if the old man says it works, I'll trust it." Engines roared to life, shaking the airfield. The smell of gasoline and dust filled the morning wind. The P-38s rolled down the strip one after another, their twin tails glinting in the sun. Up in the sky, the formation climbed slowly to save fuel. The pilots flew close together, watching the shimmering ocean far below. The air was calm, only the low hum of engines filling their ears. Lindbergh's voice came through the radio, calm and clear. "Keep it steady, boys. 1600 RPM. Let her breathe." Hours passed. The blue water stretched forever. Then, dark dots on the horizon, enemy ships. "Target in sight," Roberts said. He pushed his throttle forward, felt the engine growl. The P-38s dived out of the sun, sunlight flashing on their wings. Bombs and bullets tore through the convoy below. Black smoke rose from the ships as explosions echoed across the sea. The attack was over in minutes. The planes pulled up, climbing hard. Their engines screamed with power. Then, once clear, they eased back to cruise settings. Low RPM, lean mixture, steady flight. The gauges told the story. Fuel levels were still good, temperatures were safe. Every pilot made it home. Back at base, when they landed and checked the tanks, they couldn't believe it. Each plane had nearly 90 gallons left. Normally, they would have run out before even reaching the target. Roberts later wrote in his diary, "I used to think Lindbergh was crazy. Now I think he's a genius. We hit the enemy twice as far away and still had fuel to spare." For weeks, more missions followed. Each one proved the same thing: the ruined engines were actually stronger. The squadrons could now patrol longer, escort bombers deeper, and cover areas the Japanese never expected them to reach. Enemy pilots began to notice. Their reports spoke of American fighters showing up far from known bases, ghost planes, appearing where they shouldn't be. In one famous mission, Lindbergh himself joined a combat flight with Major Tommy McGuire, one of the top U.S. aces. The two men flew side by side over the Salebe Sea. When enemy fighters appeared, Maguire went in first. Lindbergh followed, moving with the skill of a veteran. He fired a short burst, and one Japanese Zero went down in smoke. It was the only confirmed kill of Lindbergh's military life. Maguire later said, "For a man who wasn't supposed to be here, he sure flew like one of us." When the squadron returned, everyone cheered. Lindbergh didn't brag. He simply said, "The method works, even in combat." By late August, the data was official. Across several P-38 units, range had increased by 300 to 400 miles per flight, fuel use was down by 25–30%, and not a single engine had failed from ruin. Pilots began painting small words on their cowlings. Lindy setting. It was a quiet form of respect and gratitude. The man who had once been an outsider had given them the power to go farther than ever before. Still, Lindbergh knew his time was limited. He was a civilian guest, not a soldier. Soon orders would come for him to leave the front lines. But before he went, he wanted to make sure the pilots understood not just how to fly, but why it worked. "Machines," he told them one night as the sun went down behind the palm trees, "are like people. Push them too hard and they break. Treat them with care and they'll carry you farther than you dreamed." The men nodded. They had learned that lesson in the sky, mile after mile, on wings that no longer feared ruin. But even as Lindbergh prepared to leave, his idea was already spreading beyond the Pacific. Engineers in America were listening, and soon what he started on a hot island airstrip would change how every U.S. pilot flew. By September 1944, Lindbergh's name was being whispered in places far from the Pacific jungle. In offices and hangars across America, engineers and officers were studying his reports with surprise and a little disbelief. At the Allison engine plant in Indiana, where thousands of engines for the P-38 were built, test engineers ran their own experiments. They copied Lindbergh's exact settings: low RPM, lean fuel mixture, high manifold pressure, and watched the dials carefully. The results were the same. Engines ran cooler. Fuel burned slower. No damage appeared. The test logs showed fuel savings of 25%, just like in the Pacific. One engineer wrote in his notes, "It is strange to think we have misunderstood our own engines for so long." The reports reached Washington, D.C. Commanders read them in silence. For years, manuals had warned pilots never to fly with such low RPMs, that it would ruin the bearings, overheat the pistons, and shorten engine life. But now, this quiet civilian flyer had shown that the opposite was true. The Army Air Forces began updating training materials. New leaflets were printed and sent to the Pacific, Europe, and even to bomber crews. Operate at lower RPM and high manifold pressure for best efficiency. It was a small line in a big manual, but it changed everything. Pilots in other aircraft soon followed. P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang squadrons tested the technique and found the same improvement. Bombers like the B-24 and B-25 started experimenting too. A captain from a bomber unit in the Philippines reported, "We increased our flight time by 40 minutes without touching extra fuel. It feels like we unlocked a secret." Lindbergh's method was now spreading faster than any order could. It wasn't just a trick. It was a revolution in how pilots thought about their engines. Meanwhile, back in the Pacific, Lindbergh continued to fly. He moved from base to base, helping mechanics adjust fuel systems and propeller controls. He carried his small notebook everywhere, covered in grease and sweat, filled with hand-drawn charts and numbers. At each stop, he taught the same simple idea. An engine is a living thing. Let it breathe easy. The men respected him not just for his fame, but for his calm, patient way of explaining things. He spoke like someone who understood the airplane, not just flew it. Even those who had once doubted him now treated him as one of their own. "He's not a colonel," one mechanic said, "but he sure teaches like one." The change was also practical. With longer range, U.S. fighters could escort bombers to more distant islands, attack hidden enemy airfields, and cover invasions that once seemed too risky. Each mission stretched the front lines farther toward Japan. In some cases, pilots flew 1,400 miles round trip, a record distance for a single-engine fighter just a year earlier. As the Pacific War shifted closer to Japan, this new ability became vital. It meant fewer refueling stops, fewer exposed bases, and more surprise attacks. The Japanese, who once believed American fighters could not reach certain islands, began to lose that advantage. Radar stations started reporting Allied aircraft in places that should have been safe. Lindbergh didn't take credit. In his diary, he wrote simply, "I came to teach them to fly farther, but in truth, they are teaching me what courage means." By now, even U.S. generals, once wary of his presence, were praising his work. A memo from Pacific Command noted, "Civilian technical consultant C.A. Lindbergh has contributed materially to improved operational range of P-38 aircraft." Behind that dry line was a world of change. For the first time in the war, American air power could move freely across the vast Pacific, not chained by fuel limits, not slowed by logistics. And all of it had started with an idea that sounded wrong, ruining the engine to save it. But Lindbergh's story was far from over. Soon he would be ordered back to America, and what happened next would show that even the most brilliant ideas can come with heavy shadows. October 1944. The rainy season had begun. Every afternoon, dark clouds rolled over the Pacific Islands and thunder echoed like distant bombs. On the muddy airfields, men worked under dripping tarps, cleaning guns and fixing planes. Lindbergh still flew almost every day. He didn't lead combat now. He mostly taught. He stood beside pilots in the heat and explained power settings, drawing small charts in the dirt with a stick. Everyone listened. His lessons had saved lives, but not everyone back home approved. In Washington, some officers were uneasy. Lindbergh was still a civilian, not in uniform. And before the war, he had been a controversial figure, accused of being too friendly with Germany and too critical of American leaders. When his name began appearing in military reports, high officials grew nervous. "A civilian fighting in combat? That's against the rules," one memo read. Another said, "Lindbergh's presence may cause political trouble." So, orders were sent to the Pacific. Lindbergh is to be withdrawn from operational zones immediately. The message reached the base just after sunset. The squadron commander, Major McGuire, read it twice and sighed. "They're pulling you out, sir," he said quietly. Lindbergh nodded. He had expected it. "I suppose I've stayed longer than I should." The next morning, the pilots gathered by the runway to say goodbye. The air was humid, heavy with the smell of fuel and sea salt. The men didn't want him to leave. "Sir," one said, "we'll keep using your method. We owe you for it." Lindbergh smiled faintly. "You don't owe me anything. Just keep flying smart, not hard." They shook hands one by one. When his transport plane lifted off the coral strip, every pilot on the ground raised a hand in salute. The silver aircraft disappeared into the clouds, leaving behind a trail of exhaust that faded into the gray sky. Back in the United States, Lindbergh was met with mixed feelings. Some saw him as a hero again, the man who had helped American pilots fly farther and survive longer. Others still remembered his pre-war speeches and distrusted him. He didn't argue. He avoided interviews, stayed out of politics, and focused on technical work. He wrote reports for engine makers and continued to promote better flying methods. In private, he missed the men in the Pacific. "I left a piece of myself there," he wrote in his journal, "among the planes, the heat, and the sound of engines that I learned to love again." Meanwhile, the lessons he taught continued to shape the war. The Lindbergh power setting became standard practice. Pilots who had never met him now used his technique without even knowing his name. It was simply called cruise economy mode. In late 1944, Allied aircraft used those extended ranges to launch deeper raids on the Philippines and later toward Formosa and Okinawa. They could strike farther, stay longer, and still return safely, all because they no longer feared ruining their engines. A report from the 475th Fighter Group summed it up perfectly. With the Lindbergh method, we have changed how we fight. Distance is no longer our enemy. But Lindbergh's own war was over. He returned to his quiet home life with his wife Anne and their surviving children. To most people, he had vanished again, like a shadow passing through history. Yet, for the men who had flown with him, he was unforgettable. Captain Roberts, one of his students, later wrote in a letter home, "He taught us something bigger than flying. He showed us that even in war, you can use reason, not just courage." It was a lesson they would carry long after the guns went silent, and though Lindbergh's time in the Pacific was short, its impact was vast. His quiet voice, calm hands, and strange ideas had changed the rhythm of war, proving that sometimes slowing down can be the fastest way to victory. But the war was not yet done, and soon the new flying methods he helped create would help carry America to the final battle, the road to Japan itself. Spring 1945? The Pacific War was reaching its final stage. American planes now filled the skies from the Philippines to Okinawa. Bombers flew farther than ever before, escorted by fighters that once could never have made the trip. Those long-range flights were now normal, but few remembered where the idea began. On dusty islands months earlier, one man had proved that sometimes breaking the rules could save lives. The Lindbergh method had spread quietly through the air forces, manuals were rewritten, and instructors taught new cadets how to balance speed and power, how to listen to their engines instead of forcing them. What had started as a risky experiment became official doctrine. A P-38 mechanic later said, "Before Lindbergh, we thought power meant noise and heat. After him, we learned power could be smooth, quiet, and smart." The numbers told the story. By 1945, fuel efficiency in fighter missions had improved by nearly 25%. Combat range had increased by more than 300 miles. Pilots were flying deeper into Japanese territory, staying in the air longer, and bringing each other home. When Japan finally surrendered in August, many pilots looked back and realized how much had changed. They had learned to respect their machines and their own patience. For Lindbergh, the war's end was a time of quiet reflection. He had returned to civilian life, far from the noise of the front lines. In his notebook, he wrote, "I did not fight for glory. I fought for understanding between man and machine, between power and control." History would remember him in many ways: hero, scientist, and sometimes a man surrounded by controversy. But for the pilots who had flown with him, he was simply the teacher who showed them how to fly farther than they ever thought possible. In the years after the war, Lindbergh continued to work on aviation technology. His ideas helped shape the early jet age, where the same lessons of balance and efficiency were used again, not just to win wars, but to reach across oceans in peace. Even today, pilots study the principles he proved in those war years. They call it cruise management or engine optimization. It sounds technical, but at its heart, it's the same idea. Treat the machine gently, and it will give you more than you expect. It's a quiet paradox, the same one that began on a jungle airstrip in 1944. To go farther, you must first ease off. To gain endurance, you must slow down. The men who once laughed at the thought of ruining their engines came to see that the real ruin was waste, of power, of patience, of understanding. They had entered the war believing that victory came from force. They left it knowing that true strength came from balance. As one old pilot said years later, standing beside a restored P-38 at an air show, "We learned that engines are like people. Push them too hard and they break. Trust them, and they'll take you home." And so, In the quiet hum of a running engine, somewhere between roar and whisper, the lesson of Charles Lindbergh still lives, a reminder that even in war, wisdom can fly farther than speed. In the end, America's greatest weapon wasn't just its planes or bombs. It was its ability to learn, to listen, and to change.